and Charles, I'm sharing or allowing multiple shares, so you will be able to present. So it is my pleasure to welcome Charles Martz. He is the owner of the law firm that specializes in, or one of the specialties is space law. And Charles will be presenting today on this topic on space law just in time for Congressional Visit days. And it is a good idea for everyone to be involved and informed what are the current policies and also overall trends. And I am not sure what exactly Charles will present, but I'm sure he will touch on some of the topics more or less. And it is my pleasure. Charles, your floor.
All right. Great. Well, welcome. Good morning, everybody. I am going to share my screen now. And so can everybody see the screen and hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Then what I am going to do is any topics that you really want to talk more about, I'm happy to dive into. And there's a lot of content that's here that if I always prepare such that if nobody asks any questions, though I know this group does ask questions, but there's plenty of material, but I'm happy to stop and talk about anything in particular during the way. So oftentimes, though, what people wonder is, what is space law? And, you know, first, even among young law students, those that are starting out in their career, they are surprised to hear that there's even such a thing. And of course, space law goes back really as far as we started to think about the creation of NASA or its predecessor. As soon as we started to enter into contracts, such at least within the United States, with private companies to build rockets or to build certain aspects of the different missions, the Gemini, Apollo, Mercury, and so forth, there's space law. But what do we really mean today about space law? Well, it's really kind of broken down into, in my thoughts, into 5 kind of areas of law. There's traditional law, the regulatory regime, some nuanced law, and then both domestic and space law. And so if we start off at the very beginning, what we're going to have is traditional law. So everything that you have, as I mentioned, contracts, you have intellectual property, any of those topics certainly are much broader, but you do have some core of that, some aspect of that is focused on the space industry. And then we have the regulatory regime. Certainly there are lots of regulations and so forth that have nothing to do with space, but then there are some that have a small aspect of space. Then there are others that have a much larger, such as the FAA, FCC. We'll kind of talk about some of those. Nuanced laws where they may not appear related to the space industry, but they really happen to be. I would like to, and I guess this is a cross between the regulatory regime and traditional law, perhaps. One area is environmental law. And I can maybe touch on that a little bit later. Then we have domestic space law and international space law. So my focus is really going to be primarily on international space law and domestic space law. Clearly, that's all going to encompass probably some of the nuanced area, some of the regulatory regime, but I'm going to be talking about not the side things that are out there, but really core space law. And to be honest with you, at times practicing space law right now, as I do with respect to some of my clients, can be more regular law than space law. The space aspect happens to be the fact that they're involved in the space industry, but until I'm actually completing Their license applications and so forth. A lot of times it's just contract law and intellectual property and so forth. So let's begin with international space law. What do we have? We have treaties. Actually, I need to change the directives to more resolutions and then guidelines. There are 5 space treaties. If we were going to have a quiz, it's, you don't have to fret, you don't have to sweat, because there aren't that many, for better or for worse. And we have the Outer Space Treaty, the Rescue Agreement, the Liability Convention, the Registration Convention, and the Moon Agreement. All of this information on international space law can be obtained from unusa.org, the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. So let's talk about the Outer Space Treaty. That's the short name for the Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States, and here we mean international states, countries, in the exploration use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies. It was open for signature on the 27th of, let me see if I can get this out of the way, the 27th of January, 1967, and entered into force in October of that year. The Outer Space Treaty is the space treaty. Everything else really stems from that or accentuates that. And it's worth saying, talking and focused here on the first couple of articles. The exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall be carried out for the benefit and in the interests of all countries, irrespective of their degree of economic or scientific development, and shall be the province of all mankind. Outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall be free for exploration and use by all states without discrimination of any kind, on a basis of equality and in accordance with international law, and there shall be free access to all areas of celestial bodies. We're going to come back to a few of these principles, but that is the core aspect of the Outer Space Treaty. Article 2 talks about that nothing shall be subject to the national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation, or by any other means. Article 3 focuses on the fact that the exploration and use of outer space shall be in accordance with international law, including the Charter of the United Nations, in the interest of maintaining international peace and security and promoting international cooperation and understanding. Now, I know that this group probably all knows, but of course, when we really start thinking about when this might have developed, as we'll see in just a moment, I'll get to the historical aspect of this, but comes up now. It's really, a lot of this stems from the first Sputnik and the reaction to that, and what that meant. There were concerns about space being militarized and so forth. Talking about that, I'm not going to have the full text of all the other articles. I definitely recommend it reading, at least a lawyer's recommending it reading, but it is really good reading, I think, for anyone that's interested in space. It's not a huge document, so it's an easy fireplace read or poolside read, depending on where you happen to be. Article 4 talks about no nuclear weapons. Article 5, astronauts are envoys of mankind, and every country that signed on to the agreement needs to render all assistance needed, whether they are on land, whether they land in the sea, or in space. And Article 5 also talks about that we have to disclose to the world any dangerous phenomenon that we find out in space. Article 6 talks about the responsibility for actions of government and NGOs. So there's a lot of debate actually these days on whether or not a country is responsible for what the companies that licenses do. And for example, is the United States responsible for everything that SpaceX does with respect to the Starlink satellites and so forth? Yes, for a number of reasons. One, the United States licensed the Starlink satellites, but clearly here under the treaty, the government is responsible for its actors, non-governmental organizations within its jurisdiction. Article 7 is liability for objects and the harm caused by them. Article 8, if you register an object, which they encourage that we register objects, then then you own it. You're responsible for any damages that occur from it. Article 9 emphasizes again cooperation and mutual assistance. Article 10, any country can request to observe a flight or launch. Transparency in Article 11 and openness to facilities. So basically we're not keeping any secrets. Obviously we know that countries do still keep secrets, but at least the principle was there that we are open. The latter articles are more administrative and you see them copied in each of the treaties. And again, I just want to focus on that key principle that it's carried out for the benefit of all countries and all mankind or humankind. So we've talked about the Outer Space Treaty. Let's talk about the Rescue Agreement. It's pretty straightforward. If there's a need, everybody agrees that you're going to rescue astronauts and return them, as well as objects launched into outer space. So
Charles, are your slides advancing? Because the last slide that I see is Article 7.
yes, they are. Is that coming up? Are you
No,
all?
we're Article 7 on International Space Law, Article 7 slide.
All right, let me see if I can stop a share here and then start a share again. What do you see now?
It's getting ready to pull up.
Yeah. At least we hope so.
Yeah, is that pulling up?
Still black.
Nope.
Huh.
Says you're starting to share your screen.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let me try something. Because on this end, let me see if I do this. And is it still not showing anything?
No, we can see your screen now. It's just not in presentation format.
Right. We see in the presenter mode. So we see a larger with a number of slides and
Yeah.
to the right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so what I was doing is at that moment I was switching to the, all right, so now you see it?
Yes, we see treaties.
Right, great. Don't know what's going on, but it's good to know. And definitely, I'm glad that you stopped, because oftentimes you go through a whole thing and then you realize that the person that you're talking to or the people that you're talking to couldn't hear you or didn't see what you're talking about, and that's worse for everybody, right? So treaties, we have talked about. Now let me get back to this. So let's talk about the rescue agreement. And are you still on? You're seeing rescue agreement now?
Yes.
All right. So the rescue agreement is pretty straightforward, that it's the rescue of astronauts, the return of astronauts and objects that have been launched into space. And again, keep in mind the political context of what was going on. And as we all pretty much know, President Kennedy, there might have been some aspect of exploration and thrill of the science. But a lot of that was, of course, the space race and the politics, the geopolitics that were going on. And even into 1968, the concern was that if an astronaut landed in a country other than that from which he or she was launched, that they would be held and that they wouldn't be returned. Similarly with the space objects, the different whether the capsules are returned and so forth. So this provides that everything needs to be returned. Liability Convention, you remember that these principles were articulated in the Outer Space Treaty, but again, they're expounded upon in these separate agreements. The Liability Convention, the government or the country, the launching state, is responsible for damage caused by space objects coming from it. And here we're looking at 1972. Again, UNUSA's website has all this information. And here we're talking about damage. This comes up, we've been trying in some aspects to play this or to interpret this in terms of environmental harm and or the Starlink situation. But damage means loss of life, personal injury or other impairment of health, loss of damage to property of states, natural or juridical, which is natural is like a natural person is me, a juridical or something is a company, it's law created, or property of international intergovernmental organizations. So the question would be, how far can you take that damage and what does that mean? I mean, it's pretty straightforward there, but there are ways to interpret the property or so forth. Launching state means the state which launches or procures the launching of a space object, and then a state from whose territory or facility a space object is launched. The Registration Convention talks about registration of objects launched into outer space, so that it encourages to keep a track of everything that we launch. That was January 1975. It entered into force in 1976. The important thing to remember too about these treaties is they are fluid in terms of who joins and who leaves. In 2019 February, Slovenia seceded from the treaty, and in 2018 we see that Portugal acceded to it. So we lost one, we got one. Then let's turn to the fifth, the Moon Agreement. It was open for signature December 18th, 1979. This governs the activities of states on the moon and other celestial bodies. Entered into force in 1984. So let's take a moment. That is the last time that our international community adopted or had a treaty enter into force. So we're nearly 4 decades since last space treaty. What does this provide? Basically, the moon and its natural resources are the common heritage of mankind. We saw something similar to that in the Outer Space Treaty. The moon is not subject to national appropriation by any claim of sovereignty by means of use or occupation or by any other means. That was somewhat articulated there in the Outer Space Treaty, but now let's look at 3. Neither the surface nor the subsurface of the moon, nor any part thereof or natural resources in place shall become property of any state, international, intergovernmental, or NGO, national organization, or non-governmental entity, or any natural person. This placement, and then it talks about the placement of anything on the surface of the moon does not give you the rights to that. You can't plant a flag and say this is the United States or this is Russia. Nobody can own anything. Not surprisingly, not everybody has signed on to the Moon Agreement. And if you look here down at the bottom, and I'll bring it up a little for you, you can see that we have ratified the first 4. And over here, we are not signatory to the Moon Agreement. And in fact, we're not alone in that. If you look at the totals here, so you have total ratification, accepted, approval, accession or succession, 110, and then you have total signatures 23, and over here you have 18 on the Moon Agreement and 4 signatures. So there's quite a disparity less people are also then over here on the Outer Space Treaty, less are on the Registration Convention, but dramatically by orders of magnitude, the numbers on the Moon Agreement are low. And why is that? You know, well, there's a reason. It's because it's saying that nobody can own anything on the moon, and we'll get to that in a moment. You also have resolutions on various different aspects, but we have in 2004 focusing on the launching state and making it very specific that the launching states definitely include anything under the jurisdiction of that particular of that particular country. Now, here is where the Outer Space Treaty began to an extent. International cooperation in the peaceful uses of outer space. This resolution from 1961 led to the Outer Space Treaty. The original text is, of course, available, and you'd see some echoes of what we talked before. But really, there's an argument that the Outer Space Treaty obtained its genesis from the Antarctic Treaty that was signed in 1959, talking about the exploration and use of Antarctica. There's also space law guidelines. For purposes of today, the one that I'm going to focus on a little bit is the space debris mitigation guidelines. Talking space debris and orbital debris are one and the same. The international community tends to use space debris. We in the United States, needing to be different, we talk about orbital debris. So what else internationally? What is going on beyond those principles, those documents? Well, there's engagement and policy development. United Nations conferences on space law and policy. The first one was in Moscow, 2018. I attended that conference. It was fantastic. There was a lot of informative information. Tom Stafford from the Apollo-Soyuz mission was there. You can see him second from the left and given an award. Next, the following year was in Istanbul, and it was another fantastic informative discussion. The individual here is Nicholas Hedman, who is a key player in UNUSA. There's me. I spoke on capacity building. And what's really interesting, I don't know how many of you have been to Istanbul, but if you have the opportunity, it's one, I was nervous. I will be, if you want to say prejudiced or what have you, I had preconceived notions of what going to Turkey would be, particularly given its status on the country's list, the United States State Department list. It's not one of the worst, but it's not one of the best. It's one of my favorite places to go, and the cultural history. So what you see here is there's a building, a church or whatever, a temple, mausoleum, not mausoleum, mosque, whatever you want to call it at this point in time. But this one building, let's say, actually had from the 9th century, Viking came through and carved into the stone these characters below. The building was Christian at one time, and of course it was also Muslim, has been Muslim as well, and there are the Roman ruins all right there in the same place. What are some of the issues at the conferences? Well, peaceful use of outer space continues to be a theme, right? And COPUOS, part of the United Nations, COPUOS is the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Orbital or space debris mitigation, which is a key issue. Space resource exploration, exploitation, and utilization. Space traffic management, which does relate to a large degree to the debris mitigation. Capacity building. How do we, and this is capacity building here, how do we expand knowledge on these issues? How do we involve more players? One of the things that I obtained coming from the conferences excuse me, is the interest and the desire of non-spacefaring countries that are not there yet to be involved in space. The other thing that came across is that despite that, and despite the quite diverse group of individuals, you can tell who the players are in the room. And it's interesting when they debate the particular issues that, you know, there are certain countries that have specific views, and oftentimes the majority of other countries disagree with those views. Space 2030 agenda, I recommend looking at the United Nations UNUSA's website. Cybersecurity. Last year, 2020, there was the Dark and Quiet Skies conference through UNUSA. That was virtual, and that talked about the preservation of the dark skies. So we've talked about international law. That's a brief overview of international law. Let's dive into domestic space law. So as you may or may not know, the hierarchy of law in the United States, for example, and I'm going to focus domestically, despite there being other countries represented here. I am going to focus on the United States because that's what I know best. So we have the treaties at the top. So that is governing everything that we have on the top. And then we have the Constitution. Constitution is really not applicable here other than we need to be consistent, but it's really relating to space law, the treaties, statutes, and regulations. We've talked about the treaties. Let's look at a couple statutes. Statutes are above regulations, and we're really focused on federal law here. Remember the Liability Convention? Well, that was more or less enacted into U.S. law at 51 U.S.C. or United States Code, section 50914. Essentially, that talks about the responsibility, the financial responsibility of the party. But here, rather than a government, we're talking about the license and the licensee. So when a launch or reentry license is issued, the licensee or transferee shall obtain liability insurance or demonstrate financial responsibility in amounts to compensate for the maximum probable loss from claims by a third party for death, bodily injury, property damages, and the United States government against a person for damage or loss to government property. Here's a key point. Before we talked about the governments, the state actors, and then we talked about how they are responsible for non-government, the NGOs within their jurisdiction. And it talks about the launching state. But a lot of people have been questioning what happens in a situation where one country launches a satellite and then transfers or conveys ownership that to somebody else. Is the launching state still responsible, or is somebody else? Here, at least in the United States, this talks about the transferee. So even if the United States government licenses SpaceX and it later transfers that license to a third party, the transferee is responsible. SpaceX might not still be responsible, depending. So those liability provisions were enacted, codified in the United States. Remember the Moon Agreement, where nothing in the moon above or below the ground can be owned by anybody? Well, in 2015, under the Obama administration, we enacted the U.S. Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act, which included a very small portion that said a United States citizen engaged in commercial recovery of an asteroid resource or a space resource under this chapter shall be entitled to any asteroid resource or space resource obtained, including to possess, own, transport, use, and sell the resource obtained in accordance with applicable law, including the international obligations of the United States. What's key about that? Well, we didn't sign on to the Moon Agreement, so we have no international obligations to the Moon Agreement. And if you remember, the Outer Space Treaty talked about the moon, that nobody would claim sovereignty of the moon, and that still holds. So you can't go onto the moon and plant a flag and say, we own, this is the United States territory. But if you pick up regolith, or you pick up moon rocks or asteroids and so forth, you're able to own it under United States law. That's similar to Luxembourg. You wonder, why is the small country Luxembourg? What's going on there? Well, that's SES, a large satellite company, is from Luxembourg, and there's a lot of other space activity there. So Luxembourg and the United States, at least both, have laws that would allow the ownership of space resources, where the United Nations Moon Agreement would not. But again, we're not signatory to that. Then we have regulations. So there are a lot more statutes that are applicable. But one of the things that I want to focus on today is, as Svetlana has indicated, getting ready for the Congressional Visit Days, I want to talk about capacity building, but also how each of you individually can participate beyond even Congressional Visit Days, but how you can participate and advocate your own personal interests, or if you happen to be part of an organization, perhaps their interests. So it's not impossible to do that with statutes and advocating for change on US code or new US code, but regulations, we have a much more grounds based ability to do so. So agencies. Each agency has typically its own set of regulations, and the agency is the one that promulgates those regulations. So what are some of the space-related agencies? Of course, NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, NOAA. And let's talk about these four core. There are others that have related aspects, but these are the four core agencies that I believe are space related and that we'll talk about. So within the Department of Transportation, we do have the FAA and the Office of Commercial Space Transportation. Now with the FAA, what is the FAA primarily regulating in terms of space? It's the launch. And we have the Commercial Space Launch Act, which is the enabling statute for the Office of Commercial Space Transportation. Were there launch licenses going on before that? Sure there were. But were there a lot of private launches prior to that point in time? No, I would say not. So 1984 is kind of where we start to see the number of launches and the licensing of launch sites to begin an increase. So we have the Office of Commercial Space Transportation. The enabling statute is the one that creates that aspect. And then we have enabling regulations. The CFR is the Code of Federal Regulation. So these are citations. So again, if you were looking for a statute, USC, 51 USC is United States Code. The 51 is the title, and then you have the section numbers, and the CFR is the Code of Federal Regulations. All this is electronically available, which is thank goodness. You know, that's just a side point that I started my firm in 2001. I would not have been able to do that in, let's say, 1981, because you'd have to have the volumes of books. Even though I love books, as you see, you'd have to have those long legal libraries, which would have been cost prohibitive. So what are we talking about within the OCST? Launch or reentry of vehicles, launch sites, experimental permits, safety approvals, pre-application consultation, policy review and approval, safety review and approval, payload review and determination, financial responsibility, environmental review, compliance monitoring, spaceport site licenses, and launch licenses. Now, you can get this information, which I'm about to show, on the FAA's website. You have about, what is that, about 11 there? Let's see, 3, 6, 9, 12. These are the launch sites that are currently licensed. You have 2 in Florida, which are 2 licenses in Florida, Cape Canaveral. You have Houston, the Ellington Airport, Jacksonville, Cecil Field, Mojave Air and Spaceport, New Mexico, Alaska. The last time I went to, well, the only time I've been to Alaska, I was trying to be able to go see that, but it didn't work out. Virginia, Oklahoma, everybody wants to get into this launch license, the space area. Here are the active launch licenses. So these are the licenses for the space ports, right? The launch sites. And these are the licensors for the companies that are able to launch vehicles. So you've got Orbital Sciences, Rocket Lab, Space Exploration Technologies Corporation. Of course, this is SpaceX, United Launch Alliance, Virgin Galactic. A lot of these Virgin Orbit, Lockheed Martin, Blue Origin. Here's just some, documents of their licenses. The one on the right for SpaceX. Before leaving the FAA, we should also point out that it regulates moored balloons, kites, amateur rockets, unmanned free balloons, certain model aircraft, and drones, which is another area that I'm interested in. Commercial remote sensing regulatory affairs. So, as you all may or may not know, if you launch a satellite, so FAA is the launch, the FCC, I'm going to get to, it's ordered somewhat narratively speaking in the PowerPoint slide. So before we get to the FCC, which regulates communications, NOAA regulates if you're looking back at Earth. So if you are looking back at Earth observation, then you're going to have to also get permission through NOAA. And that's the Commercial Remote Sensing Regulatory Affairs. No person who's subject to the jurisdiction or control of the United States may operate any private remote sensing space system without a license, and authorize the Secretary of Commerce to license private sector parties to operate private remote sensing space systems. So you can't send a satellite up there to look back and spy on your neighbor, or to, even for environmental purposes, to look at climate change and so forth. You have to have a license through NOAA if you're looking back at Earth. NOAA does licenses and annual audits. And then there are also quarterly audits that you have to do. There's cybersecurity again. Cybersecurity, remember, we had that point of one of the topics at the United Nations. It's key. I mean, the launch codes, launch computers, we've heard about hacks getting into our government, getting into private organizations. I have to worry about that. This past week, my 2 or 3 of my staff members, Norton, kept popping up that somebody was trying to do a brute force attack. So I'm the IT guy in addition to the principal attorney, and had to deal with that and keep them out. So I definitely recommend using an antivirus program that's going to protect your computers, because they're out there. The NOAA license data protection template has information to help. And even within this, though, there exists coordination between other agencies, the Department of State, Department of Defense, the Department of the Interior, JCS, Director of National Intelligence, and there's a lot to get into that we could, but we don't have time. I just want to mention, some of you may be familiar with ITAR and EAR. The ITAR is the International Traffic in Arms regulations, the EAR with the Department of State. So ITAR is on the Department of State side. EAR, which is the Export Administrative Regulations, is on the Department of Commerce side. Regulates what information you can share with a non-US citizen. So and this SpaceX does not hire international interns for this reason. And in fact, I was talking to one of my clients who was looking at a potential intern that had been denied from SpaceX because she was international. And right, you can go through and get a license for an individual that is not a US citizen to have exposure to these documents and information or technology, but I guess the waiting period seems to be 9 months, which exceeded beyond the summer internship, so it would have been a moot point. But violations of these regulations carry significant penalties. So anybody involved in the space industry in the United States needs to be very careful of ITAR and EAR. And one thing's traffic and arms regulations. I'm not trafficking in arms. I don't have to worry about that. You'd be surprised how broad those regulations are and what is on the United States munitions list. It is the United States munitions list, but the technology is broader than your missile, your bullets, and so forth. So let's turn to the FCC. Let's have some fun here, talking about how you can this weekend dive in and advocate for a change in policy or keeping the policy. So their main 47 is again the kind of the title, and then you have the sections or chapters, or the sections rather, but the 47 CFR sections 5 is experimental radio service, 25 is satellite communications, which you'd primarily be concerned about, and then 97 is amateur radio service. So here is a copy of the SpaceX application, the order rather, giving approval for the deployment of the famous Starlink mega constellation satellite. And that kind of has brought up, so I've given an overview now and the brief aspect of the FCC, but rather than what I want to do now, talking about advocacy, is dive into two issues that I'm particularly involved in right now. And I'm going to go into more aspects of the FCC specifically as we go through and we talk about those two issues. The first is orbital debris. And I'm not going to play through all of these, but I do think that they give a sense of the urgency that orbital debris has come to play in defining certain aspects of space law and policy. We cannot ignore the environment, Earth's orbital space. I advocate for considering the orbital space around Earth as part of its environment, necessarily so. And so when we're thinking about satellites, just let's say pre-Starlink, there were about 5,500 satellites in orbit. That includes functional and non-functional satellites. We've got this picture. Let's see it from a different perspective. Let's see if this is the one that no, that's the same one. Here we go. While I'm talking, so 5,500 satellites, including both those that are functional and non-functional. And this is a simulation. Obviously, we're not actually seeing Earth there, but this is based on the data, the registration of objects and so forth in space. So it's real data. It's not just hypothetical. Of those 5,500, about 2,753, let's just say 3,000 were functional satellites. So 5,500 total satellites, 3,000 of those were functional. Within the last year and a half, since May 2019, with the first launch of the 60 set Starlink satellites, Starlink's added another 1,000 satellites. So 33% increase from the number of functional satellites just in that amount of time. And they obviously have a license for a lot more. That's one company in one country. We obviously have OneWeb that has a license for a mega constellation. So it's a real concern. There's what's also called the Kessler Syndrome or Kessler Doctrine, which is basically that we may get to a point with objects in space to where there's a cascading effect, where it's necessarily going to be so many objects in space that there will be collisions that will simply cause more and more debris. This is from the European Space Agency. So this is looking at it from the perspective of the size of the object, right? And when we talk about the Kessler, his argument is that we get to a point where we're talking about a certain number of debris now, not just the satellites that are functional or non-functional, but debris objects. Let me see if I can move this out of the way because that might be where it's giving the size. And these debris objects are going to continue to increase. And at a certain point, we'll get to where there's so many objects out there that more collisions will occur that will create more debris, and it'll just be a cascading effect. And the problem with space traffic management, of course, and for purposes of launching and exploring space, is making sure you're not hit by this debris as you're launching from Earth and moving forward. And you can see a number of different orbits there. There's the close orbits here. You can see the orbit around here, the outer band there, and then here I'm just going to stop there. You can kind of see a picture. It's messy and it's not sharp at this point, but you get the impression here of what's going on. And just to one final thing, this is India. This is what India did. That was intentional. That was intentional. They blew up an old satellite, and this was the debris field that they caused. They thought, that there wouldn't be an issue. There was, because they couldn't control the debris. And look at it again. It just was real. I don't think that there was any harm in saying that it was real negligence and stupidity. You can see here where a debris object hit a solar panel that was in space. That's not a gun. That's a bullet hole. That's not a bullet hole. That's a debris field. Now turning back, or debris impact. Turning back to the international aspect, we've also got the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee. That was formed in 1983. That's when the international community really started paying attention to space debris or orbital debris. It was NASA, RKA, Japan, and the ESA. And it issued guidelines, support to the guidelines. It has a statement on large constellations. I think that was 2007, maybe, a protection manual. These guidelines led to UNUSA and COPIAS adopting space debris mitigation guidelines. And those voluntary guidelines emerged after a 13-year process. They emerged also from the IADC guidelines with consideration of the United Nations treaties and other international agreements. Space debris or orbital debris is all human-made objects, including fragments and elements thereof in Earth orbit or re-entering the atmosphere that are non-functional. Now, keep in mind that we try to track all of the satellites, and that's assuming that every country is reporting every satellite that they launch or object. And we try to keep track of the debris objects, but there's a point at which you can't keep track of every paint fleck. And, all right, so we saw a solar panel of a satellite been impacted. What's the danger, right? Well, as some of you may know, the space shuttle was impacted by the windshield was actually impacted. One of the windshields was impacted by space debris. The International Space Station has been impacted by space debris. That was a piece, an object that was on the Russian side, and one of the Russian minister thought that it was a conspiracy of the United States to cause damage. It wasn't, but it was space debris. So it's a real issue. And so the FCC started looking at this back in 1995 at the impetus of the Clinton administration. The White House Office of Science and Technology started an interagency report. But skipping over a long history that I could go into, it wasn't really until 2020 that we got to the point where we were implementing specific metrics and real regulations that were more than just a passing phase or a passing response, that licensees, those seeking a license from the FCC, would have to answer to. And so there were notices of proposed rulemaking back in starting in 2018, 2020, we started to see some of those come out of the new rules come out of comments. There was a further proposed rulemaking at the end of 2020, and the final regulations from that should be coming from the FCC soon. One of the issues is changing the end of life aspect of satellites. So we have the mission period, which is where it's functional and being used, and then from the end of mission to end of life is where it either deorbits or it's pushed further out into the graveyard, so to speak. The danger in pushing satellites into the graveyard is going through the orbit of other functioning satellites. Similarly, for those that are further out on the kilometer scale in geo, beyond LEO, is you can't really you don't necessarily want to bring them back through LEO because you're going to have to navigate all of that. But the end of life is when they're either pushed out or burned in reorbit. And right now, the minimum, they have to have an end of life of 25 years. Think about that. From end of mission to end of life, 25 years. That's a long time, particularly when we're thinking about SpaceX has just launched 1,000 satellites within the last 14, 16 months. So there's a big push. The FCC has suggested 5 years, which really is not that difficult, I think. Of course, I'm not an engineer per se working on satellites, reentry aspects. I'd welcome thoughts on that. To kind of get to how can we do something about it? How can we voice our concern? And leading to the end here of my presentation, I want to focus on another issue that's similarly related to Starlink and the debris aspect, but it's the light pollution or the solar reflectivity of Starlink. And you all perhaps have seen this image of the launch back in 2019 of the Starlink satellites. This is before they've, this is still in their raising phase before they've reached their orbit, their fixed orbit. Here's an image that I obtained. It was off chance that I happened to be outside doing some astrophotography, and I turned around and saw them going across the sky. And I wanted more to make sure that the family saw it and knew what I had been working on and talking about over the last several months than really trying to set up and get a good photo. But that is the Starlink satellites from my backyard. Here's another image of them coming across different fields of view. This is cool, but nonetheless, for astronomers and other scientists, it raises a really big issue in terms of interference with not only optical, but radio and infrared astronomy. So what did SpaceX do about this? Well, Elon had a kind of dismissive response initially, but since then, under his company's leadership, and so forth, SpaceX, to give them a significant amount of credit, has really been responsive. So this is Starlink 60 set, ready to go. And then this is basically what it would look with the solar panels up. This is the license application. You can see here you can obtain this information from the FCC's website. You can see the date that it was filed. And here's more specifically the term date. All of this is information that you can get. You can get other filings related to this, such as people objecting or doing a comment. And one of the questions has been since May of 2019, how come the astronomers are so late in raising the problem only after the first launches? And that's a very good question. And there's an answer that was received that we'll get to in a bit. But really, essentially, it breaks down to the fact that they weren't paying attention to this. And of all of these comments, of all the responses to this particular application for SpaceX's Starlink mega constellation, there were no comments related to astronomy and astrophysics. But as I said, SpaceX did, and Elon has picked up on the objections and the concerns. And so what they have done is they've started to develop technology to help mitigate that. Now here, what we have is just a showing of the shark fin and the open book type phases of the satellite. But depending on the way that the satellite is turned or facing, that can reduce the solar reflectivity. And we can get into orbit aspects and so forth, but changing here shows kind of how it can avoid or minimize the solar reflectivity. But they've also gone beyond that. And so they developed DarkSat, which basically is coating part of the satellites darker to minimize the solar reflectivity. The problem with that, of course, is, as we all know, dark absorbs heat and more so than light, and that creates a problem for the satellite. So what did they do? They went beyond that, and now they've created VisorSat. So there was one satellite that had the DarkSat technology, and now with VisorSat, every satellite launch since they've developed that will have the VisorSat mitigation. And so basically it's a shade, a sunshade, blocks the sunlight from the antennas, preventing the reflection. You can get updates on their website about those efforts. There have been a number of organizations specifically related to that led to conferences last year. There was SatCon 1 and the Dark and Quiet Skies Conference, which we mentioned earlier. Now let's turn to the FCC, or this is just saying some of the agencies that are involved. I'm running out of time, so I want to get to this part here. So when you go to the FCC, you can go to regulations.gov and find a lot of information, but the FCC on different agencies and their regulations, and I'll show that in a second. But the FCC is unique in that the FCC has its own specific portal for commenting on regulations, and that's fcc.gov/ECFS, the Electronic Comment Filing System. I think I might have some duplicates here. Ones and some are going to be better focus and enlarged, but bear with me here. So you can search the full text over here. You can go to search for filings, put in the text, and then you get a bunch of results, right? And over here is the preceding number. And you can click, all these are hyperlinked, the received and the posted dates. You can get into, if you look down here, the International Bureau, this is relating to the orbital debris aspects. If I'm not mistaken, yeah, well, let's see, this is 19285. We'll see what this happens to be. So this is actually not, this is a different one. So you put in Starlink, you might get different documents. You can click and pull them up. Then you can see the actual document, the date it's adopted. This is a report and released. You can go here to the Federal Register and search for different regulations. The Federal Register is where the official publication of registration or regulations that are being proposed and so forth. So you can search regulations.gov, which I highly recommend, because even with the FCC regulations, they'll show up there. It's just a different portal to comment. So regulations.gov is the one that you should remember. But FCC/ECFS is where you file the comments for the FCC. Regulations.gov is you can comment on almost everything else. But Federal Register is where they're officially published. So even though the FCC might pronounce or issue regulations, until they actually show up in the Federal Register, the clock on the notice period hasn't started. So you can go to the Federal Register online and put in search terms here, orbital debris, and we can find some of the same documents. This is docket number 18313 in the matter of mitigation of orbital debris. This is what the FCC has been focused on. So if I search Federal Register for orbital debris, I might find one of these and then pull it up. I see the docket number. Then I can go back to the FCC/ECFS, put in 18313. It populates while you're typing. So I see exactly what I want there. It'll tell you what the comment date, the reply comment date is. But again, as you see, it's 45 days after the date of publication in the Federal Register. So if you're really paying attention, you get more time than just waiting for the Federal Register to come up and show it. And then when you're submitting a filing, you can drop the files in here. I mean, it's just basically a standard filing, and or you can put brief comments in down below. Regulations.gov is a lot simpler. It is still in beta form, I think, but you can search. You put in a search term Starlink, different options will come up for whatever your topic happens to be. NASA, you can pull it up and obtain, click on the hyperlink document and obtain the information. That was a notice of a meeting. Here's a notice of proposed rulemaking. Now this is where I was searching for various things on environment in the space and the Council on Environmental Quality. And I'm running late here, so I'm not going to get into too much detail really quick, but this was a response to that question before. Why are astronomers coming so late? And not to necessarily answer that, but to echo the sentiment, to put our work into perspective. A few years ago, I visited the U.S. Senate committee. Staffers ignore the spelling errors to urge astronomy funding, and the chief staffer for the committee said, "We love you astronomers, but we hear from you only once a year. I get a call from Lockheed Martin every day." And that demonstrates the point that it's advocacy. It's making sure that people hear you often, and there's no sense of redundancy. There's no problem in redundancy. There's no problem in advocating and making sure that your voice is heard. So where can you submit comments and regulations? Again, fcc.gov, ECFS, regulations.gov. Here's the larger version. So we come to the ECFS, we can search, we can put in text, orbital debris, it'll pull up results, and we can see any number of things that we might be interested in. Up here, you can see the docket, the 18313. So you can then search for that. You can see this. We can click International Bureau, or we can click the individual document. If we click the individual this is if we click the International Bureau rather than the PDF, it'll come up with each of the documents listed. We can click and see each of them. You don't need to be a law firm to file. That was just the law firm that filed, the FCC. And you can see any of the documents. Submit a filing through the ECF system. Again, put in the docket number. Once we found it, it self-populates with that, and we see the one that we want on the top. We can go to submit a filing. We click, so we've clicked that, and then we just go through and put the information in that we want, and we can upload documents. A lot, you don't necessarily need to be a law firm. You don't need to be a law firm. You would put the name of the filer. the author name, ignore attorney if you're not an attorney. So you just fill that information out. Now you want to see how easy it can be, and we are nearing the end. Orbital debris. Here's regulations.gov. So let's say mitigation of orbital debris. We can see it does show the FCC rule. So you still can find it through regulations.gov. And then it would tell you that you'd need to go somewhere else to file a comment. But you can sort the comments here that are due, newer to older. And just to show how easy it is, this is showing FCC again, but to show on others how easy it is. So let's say that we want to see the comments coming due soon, today or the next 3 days. We can just pick this one, elimination of customs broker permit fee, and we click comment, and it's just start typing here. So it's really a lot easier to get into that effort and to submit a comment. And I encourage each of you to do that, because if I'm an attorney, yes, and I've done that, but anybody can do it on any particular issue. Here is where I sent a letter to the Council on Environmental Quality, talking about my position that the Earth's orbital space should be considered part of the environment. The United Nations Environmental Program was coming up with UNEA 5. I submitted a letter to them advocating the same thing. Now, events of interest coming up. How can you get involved beyond filing your own response or comments on regulations that any of the federal agencies of the United States might put? What are some events coming up of interest? Let me get this out of the way. Promoting Space Sustainability Project, February 9th. That's coming up next week. This is through UNUSA's website. You can go. And there's also the Making Space for Women, a meeting coming up on February 11th to the 12th that anyone can sign up for. Also, there's the IA Planetary Defense Conference coming up April 2021. Space Symposium 365 is now virtual so that you have content available 365 days. And then, of course, the 36th Space Symposium is coming up this year, August 2021, back in Colorado. I've been a couple times, and I've never seen so much military, so many people in military, other than on a movie. So this is like this space event. There's also SpaceCom, others. Search for those areas that are interest. Go to the conferences if you can. But one of the things that we're going to talk about, or that Svetlana started us off discussing or mentioning, is Congressional Visits Day. And that's participating in the CVDs for the organizations in which you're involved. And here, AIAA, the Congressional Visits Day are March 19th, virtual this year, and we want to advocate for aerospace. So with that, I'm going to stop the share and open it up. I hope that I've given an overview of some of the issues, space law and policy, and some of the ways in which you can participate and be your own voice as well as the voice of others.
Thank you, Charles. It was quite enlightening, and I wanted to ask you, as you were going through some of the regulations, but then it probably would have prevented you from, going through the train of thought. So one thing I wanted to check, even though those treaties are in place and were set by United Nations and other organizations, international organizations, you only have to abide, meaning one country has to abide if they ratified it, right? If that R stands there, or if all the full signatures have been obtained from that country. Is that correct?
Correct. You only have to abide by the terms of the treaty if you've agreed to it. So with the Moon Agreement, given the United States has not agreed to it, it doesn't mean anything to us.
Okay.
And in fact,
and that's Right. There's only 4 countries, right, that have agreed to it.
No, there are more than that. There's like a total of, I know that's a little confusing. Like on that slide, it talks about that there are 4 that have signed the like 4 signatures, but
Right.
there are other
And
ways. There are other ways of approving it. So I think the total number is 18 or 22 total. But
okay.
when you consider the number of countries that are members of the United Nations, that's a really small fraction. And like I said, not only has the United States not adopted the Moon Agreement, its laws, our law currently is in contravention, disagrees with the Moon Agreement, as Luxembourg's does as well.
Okay. So basically, it's obviously inference from the inaction of countries, or many countries, that there are plans to do otherwise, to actually claim a stake, to put a flag, and at least hold that particular space as either for future commercialization or other purposes.
Yeah, well, let me clarify. I think that still under the Outer Space Treaty, you can't plant a flag and claim any, like you wouldn't be able to claim any asteroid. Let's put that aside. You still can't claim any part of the moon or a planet, let's say, as owned by a particular sovereignty. That's still in the Outer Space Treaty. You can't do that. What the distinction is, that the Moon Agreement expands beyond that and says that if I go to the moon and I start mining on the moon, or I start collecting rocks or minerals and so forth, that the Moon Agreement says that you can't own that. And in fact, the Moon Agreement goes beyond that and says that anything that you acquire has to be shared and open for scientific research to anybody. So I think it's not so much that the countries are wanting to claim sovereignty over any particular space or plant a flag. It's that they see the commercial opportunities for mining and so forth. And what's really interesting is Russia was one of the countries that initially advocated for the Moon Agreement, but it backed away. I think it quickly saw that if the United States was not going to sign on, it wasn't going to sign on. And I think that, for better or for worse, I think that we're in a phase where the commercialization of space is definitely key now. And I think for companies to see a value in space exploration, they're wanting to see that the ability to get that return on value, which the Moon Agreement would have prevented.
I see. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's definitely something that for commercial companies, there has to be a reason why, not just altruistic reason to open other worlds. There's in many cases there's also stakeholders or stockholders, that is, and that most likely would like to see a benefit, a return on their investment.
Yeah, and I mean, from my perspective, I see it both ways. I mean, I can understand that, but one would like to see that just the excitement and the exploration of space would be enough. One comment that I'd make is that if you really want to see, though, going to what you were alluding to, Svetlana, on like going to a celestial body, let's say Mars in the example that I'm going to give, and claiming ownership of particular land and so forth, you really should watch the National Geographic series Mars if you haven't seen it, because it plays that issue out very good. I mean, it's a very good play on that. Obviously that's interspersed with commentary. It's like a combination fiction, drama, and documentary, but it plays that issue and the consequences of looking at enforceability. Like, how are you going to enforce these laws on Mars anyway?
There are a couple, I think, unfortunately, Ellen already left, but since we're recording this, maybe you can answer her question, and then she can, or I can point her to the time in this particular recording. What about satellite installations blocking telescope views? What do you think about this issue?
I think it's a significant issue, and I've been heavily involved in that over the last year and a half or so. I don't know that some of you may or may not know, but the way that I became interested in space law and started practicing it is I've been practicing technology law, internet law, since I started my firm in 2001. And in 2016, I wanted to do something different. Like, it was either learn to play the cello and so I could play the Game of Thrones theme, or as it happened, I ended up started taking graduate astrophysics classes at the University of Chicago. So as I was doing that and taking my first graduate astrophysics class, which I have to say was the most difficult class that I've ever taken, but it was actually the most rewarding class that I've ever taken as well, because it was challenging and intellectually stimulating. But at that time, that's kind of where a colleague of mine called, and she was looking for work, and she lived in Houston, and that's how we got connected and opened the Houston office, and it expanded from there. But I've always had that connection then to the astronomers and the astronomy community. So when Starlink came, when people really recognized it as an issue in 2019, it really has been a significant issue, particularly on the optical side. And you see that there are the satellites that are crossing the telescope images, the cameras and so forth. And that there's another, if you Google Starlink DCAM, and I'll put, in the, if you put that, you'll see another famous photograph of the Starlink satellites crossing the field of view of the dark energy camera. And that's a telescope in Chile. So there is a problem there. There's also a problem with respect to interference on radio astronomy. And then there's also a concern about infrared astronomy, particularly given the fact that, like, on DarkSat, if that was the heat signature from the satellites can still interfere with the infrared astronomy. So the astronomy community has been working with SpaceX and a couple other companies on trying to mitigate those issues. And SpaceX has definitely taken a leadership role with the development on the technology side of DarkSat and VisorSat. The astronomy community has also taken a role in trying to figure out, how are we going to mitigate this? How can we extract or eliminate the streaks from the images that they capture and so forth? But I do believe that it is an issue. And what I kind of skipped over is that, it took from 1993 to 2020 for there to be real regulations in the United States on orbital debris mitigation. And that's a period of nearly 3 decades. We don't have the same kind of time period to have the FCC adopt regulations to address solar reflectivity and asking questions about the environment and so forth. And so what I suggest is that we pick up on this opportunity now, where the FCC is focused on looking at orbital debris and looking at, for lack of a better term, Earth's orbital space as part of the environment, that it also looked to this issue. But right now there's no regulations relating to it. What's interesting is that if you apply for an FCC license, there is a question that is asked: will this license have any impact on the environment. But it talks about within the scope of the particular statute. And in the United States, NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act, which created the Council on Environmental Quality, which is out of the White House. And every agency has to provide an environmental impact statement, and every agency has to require an applicant or a licensed applicant to identify whether there's an environmental impact. But the FCC's interpretation on environmental impact has been that basically for the FCC, there's no environmental concerns. That, you know, there are some exceptions like on Native American lands and so forth, but the FCC's perspective is our regulation, our jurisdiction comes once we're up in space, and so there's no environmental aspect. And that needs to change in my mind.
That is, I totally agree. And Charles, I just shared right now the image that I believe you were referring to. I also had posted the link to that image. So you see the basically the Starlings crossing. Yes. Yeah.
And what's been fun too for me is I wanted to learn more of the technical side and the impact of the satellites on astronomy. So returning back to taking the astrophysics classes at the University of Chicago, last quarter, I took an independent study with a professor that is involved in the dark energy study. And so I taught him a little bit about the policy side, and he taught me a lot about the technological side behind the issues. And so I really dove back into Python programming and had a blast. I've told other people that Python is like my natural high. I could sit for hours doing programming. And that's a whole nother discussion. So if somebody wants to see some of the things I've been doing with the satellites and policy on the programming side, let me know. But I definitely, if there's any point that I want to get across, it's circling back to Svetlana's mention of congressional visit days and the advocacy, because you can voice your concern, you can voice your comments, even if it's going on and just typing comments out in that little box at regulations.gov or the ECFS. Do so, because you're not alone. There are individuals that do that. There are regulatory hearings when we get back to a non-COVID era, or at least a controlled COVID era. Those hearings are public. You can submit your name to get on the list to go up and speak. But I definitely, travel costs and so forth are one thing, but getting online and putting in your comments is another. And they do look at the comments. And even if the agency might not necessarily pick up on something that you say, other people might. And so, for example, I submitted a letter recently on the, because I was talking to people at the I was talking at SatCon. I was mentioning a comment at the SatCon conference, and people are saying, well, how hard is it to post comments, or shouldn't the AAS, the American Astronomical Society, post comments? And some of the response was there's not enough time to study it and to develop the comment. And my response to that, my reply was, you can individually go on and put your comments in. And so I did. And then one of the companies, actually SpaceX, I think it was, picked up on one of the arguments that I had made and shortening that end of life from 25 years to 5 years. So you may, other organizations that might have more weight, let's say, will pick up on comments that you make and cite them. So I definitely encourage it. I wouldn't be embarrassed. Don't hesitate to do it. That's what it's there for.
And there's something about, there's a power in numbers, and you may feel as one person right now, but those comments and the opinion, even if it's for or against, the staffers, they do count them. They almost put a tick mark on the for or against the specific regulations, and then they see whether their constituents support it or not. And again, it's you may feel that you are just the one person, but there's more than one person like you. And if all of us share what we believe or our opinion about issues, it definitely will help to make it more. Hopefully, it's not always can go according to what your desire, but at least it will be according to majority.
Right. And you never want to be in a position where, you know, it's like the classic example, and maybe this is a bad use of this example, but I think that the principle is the same. You know, that we learned in law school, that classic, it was in New York City, I believe, where there was a woman being attacked in the parking lot or the open space below the apartment building, and she was screaming for help and so forth, and nobody called. The guy and the guy attacking her ran away and came back, attacked her again, and then ran away, and still nobody called. And afterwards, in the exploration of that, they asked people why they didn't call the police, and the response was, I figured somebody else would be doing it. And it drives home the point that that's such a fallacy, and that's such a, in our society, that we tend to think that we don't need to do something because other people will be doing it. We can't rely on that presumption, because, like, for example, with the Starlink application, maybe there were astronomers that looked at it and knew about it, but they thought somebody else would be responding, and so nobody raised any issue about astronomy on the Starlink application. One comment to pick up on what Svetlana just said is, I don't know what the weight is now with email, but when I worked for Senator Chuck Robb, who was married to her, may still be married to Linda Bird Johnson, the daughter of Lyndon Johnson. You know, one of the things that I learned is that I worked in the Richmond office, and there was a certain weight given to the manner in which the constituents contacted the office. So somebody picking up a phone is not the same weight as somebody writing a letter. And basically, it's the amount of time invested in communicating with the particular policymaker or politician. The more time that you take, it demonstrates that you're more committed about it. And so what is that weight? It basically would be like a phone call might be 10 constituents, right? If we received a letter, it might be valued at 50 or 100 constituents. So the more time that you spend in writing your particular congressperson or communicating with them, the more weight it's going to be. That being said, if you've only got 30 seconds, pick up the phone and call and let them know what you think.
Doing something is better than doing nothing. That's my approach.
I agree.
Absolutely.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, if there's any other questions, please do ask.
Well, I have a number of questions and issues, and maybe we can continue this next week because we're out of time. But on the subject of light pollution, I'm an old amateur astronomer, and we had light pollution from other items before the space program even started. And so I could understand the if an astronomer was to want to continue his research into objects in the universe, it would be a very serious blow to him to understand there's going to be thousands of satellites coming into low Earth orbit. So I would regard that the light pollution for astronomy is a major failing of the space law industry, if you call it industry, because that should not have happened. They should have been involved in it, and the space law people should have gotten the astronomers involved in it and not just sat back and say, well, if they don't say anything, I guess it's okay, and then they run forward. I'm not talking about the space law people. I'm talking about commercial industry wanting to put satellites up there and not being blocked or constrained in any way, at least from the astronomy point of view. So bottom line is, maybe Charles, you have an excellent presentation. I enjoyed every part of it.
Thank you.
And it was a very good overview of the whole, platform of the space law area. But from the lesson learned, is there something that can be done to engage organizations that would be affected, but they don't know anything about it until it happens, like the astronomy situation? Is there any activity that the space law industry can instigate to prevent that kind of thing from happening again?
That's a really good question, Mike, and I agree with all of what you said. I think for purposes of brevity right now, I would say doing things like this. I mean, and participating in organizations and telling people to advocate for their interests and educate them, because I agree it was a failing. It was a failing of the entire community. The ability was there for anybody to comment. The ability was there for anybody to object. The ability was there for anybody to attend hearings, and there was silence on that particular aspect. And so fortunately, SpaceX since has gone into the technology and tried to mitigate it with the dark set and the visor set, but they didn't have to. There's no requirement for them to do so. They could have still said, this is our business, we're doing what we want to do. So I agree with you 100%. And I think that is an ongoing question, is how can we ensure, but I think that it's ensure that those all voices are heard. And I think it's education and awareness. That's probably the two words that I would say most: education and awareness. And each of you now, going your Saturday afternoon, your Saturday evening, if you talk to somebody, mentioning it, I think it's having additional conversations and debates and thoughts and so forth. That's what I would say.
Yeah, thank you, Charles. I'm not an astronomer, but I have been an amateur astronomer from high school days. It was a few years ago. And so,
Yeah.
I remember when Sputnik was launched, and my friends and I, we had a little telescope about that long. And so I thought, I'm going to go outside, and with my telescope, I'm going to find that Sputnik. And so I searched for a long time and then realized that there's no way I'm going to find that thing.
Yeah.
So that was a great thing for me to try to find a satellite in those days. But
Well, yeah. And and there's a certain, there's a certain coolness to seeing the Starlinks like fly across the sky and seeing, I will admit that I was like, that's pretty cool. But then you also think about the other aspects, and you can think about, the worst period of time for the Starlink satellites is as on the orbit raise period, where they're closest to Earth and they're actually getting to their final orbit. But nonetheless, we still see the ISS. You can go out and that you can definitely see across the sky. And when it's one or just a few, it may not be as much of an issue, but I think the sheer numbers that we're talking about and what are planned is and it's everybody. I had a conversation with the client yesterday that, I don't have a SpaceX as a client, love to, but my client was talking about launching a small constellation of about 130 satellites. And you figure that just think about all the small companies out there that want to do that and multiply that, so I think that these issues need to be thought about. I do think that we need to view Earth's orbital space as part of Earth's environment, which right now it's not. The Council on Environmental Quality out of the White House, it sets the environmental policy for the United States. And I think that the argument is there to interpret the Earth's orbital space as part of the environment. But if the CEQ were to explicitly articulate that the Earth's orbital space was part of Earth's environment, that would be a paradigm shift, because then every agency would have to look at the orbit around Earth as part of the environment and how are we affecting that. And it's not just humans. I mean, we could get into much more, and you alluded, Mike, to the other light pollution issues, but it's much more that it's more than humans rely on the constellations for their natural behavior and navigation, which is amazing. I mean, it's a whole nother subject, but anyway, I appreciate the compliments. I appreciate the discussion. I could talk for hours, but I know that we don't have that. So I appreciate the time, and Svetlana, you giving me the opportunity to talk.
A very quick question. I thought about the regulatory bodies. I thought it was peculiar when the two different launches that ended up in spectacular explosions of SpaceX. One is being investigated by FAA, but the last one is investigated by another regulatory agency. And I thought that is it because at what point in the mission the explosion took place? I wasn't sure why it is, and I honestly forgot what was the second agency, but it was not FAA.
I think it's the FCC, and to be honest with you, I don't know the specifics enough to comment on that, but I will come back with that answer for you, because you're not the first person this week that has asked me about that. Somebody asked, why is the FCC investigating this SpaceX explosion? I do believe that, but the FAA and the FCC, even though their jurisdictions definitely demarcated in terms of launch and then operational aspects, but they bleed over with one another. But I will find the answer and get back to you all.
Okay, and one more announcement, or a couple announcements. Jorge just posted, and you can see in the chat the planned out speakers for the virtual luncheon meeting. That one is coming up on February 11th, and the speaker will be Mike Hass, and he is absolutely dynamic, phenomenal speaker. I've seen him talk a number of times, and so I highly recommend for you to join. There will be a couple others. There's the Engineers Without Borders who will be speaking on April 8th, and of course, JSC Center Director Mark Geyer will be our June speaker. So I definitely encourage you to dial in to participate. It will be over Zoom. And one more actually on Monday, I believe it's coming, yes, on February 8th, will be AIAA webinar on sustainability in flight. So this is environmental and our journey through decarbonization. And I believe that this is something we should keep track of and see where the industry's commitment to environmental and sustainability goes, and how it can be supported within the industry. So I highly recommend the webinar is free, and AIAA all virtual events are free too, and please encourage you to join if you have time. I know those are during day. I asked my husband, Dave Hansen, to to sit on the Sustainability in Flight webinar because I will be working during that time. And hopefully he will come here and report in one of the future meetings. Mike, thank you for an idea. I think that next week, since we do not have a specific speaker, I would like to put as a theme light pollution. Maybe we can, and this will be open forum, and people can bring either their ideas, questions, and hopefully someone from here, from attendees, can either answer, or we can just talk, hypothesize, discuss, and ideas and possible solutions.
Yeah,
that,
maybe
yeah.
light pollution and other issues on space law. How about that?
Okay, that
I
sounds good.
have other issues to bring up on space law.
Okay, and I know that Charles had volunteered a while back to also come back with the analysis of the from his one of his graduate courses of the I believe remind me, I've seen a couple of swarm, was it the swarm satellites or one of the analysis, and I think we just, okay, my screen just rearranged everything. So we'll hopefully this is not the last time we see Charles presenting something to us, and I really enjoyed this, and I will be posting this on the SpaceGeekSpeak channel on YouTube. We are getting a few more digging from the previous presentations that have been already recorded, and we'll be posting there as well. So enjoy, and thank you so much for joining today. I am looking forward to our next week interaction. It's important to me, and I hope that everyone else enjoying too. Have a great week, and see you next Saturday. Thank you, Charles.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charles.
Yeah,
Thank
you're
you.
welcome.
Thank you, Svetlana.
That was great.